Increase in us true religion and bring forth in us the fruits of good works. Please be seated. I don't know, I kind of like the stoop. Maybe I should have kept that there. A new rector arrives at her church, and as she is settling in, she discovers a certain liturgical flourish. She notices that every Sunday, every service actually, that as acolytes and choir members and clergy process from the nave, the back, to the chancel up in the front, each one, as they do so, they each pass a candlestick. And as they do so, they each lovingly and reverently touch that candlestick and then continue on towards their seats. Now, she can see that this is a beloved custom for them. Choir members outdo themselves in their posture of reverence to this candlestick. Liturgical ministers' faces change ever so slightly as they go from singing the hymn to a moment of self-conscious reflection as they touch the candlestick. Altar servers and acolytes are getting in on the game because they too mimic the faces of those adults as they too touch the candlestick and then continues on. Now, the rector is a wise woman, and she adopts the practice immediately, but she is curious. Where did this tradition come from, this beautiful and distinctive moment of devotion? Was this candlestick donated by a founder or by a matriarch a few generations back? Was this candle made by someone's family? She asks around, but she doesn't get a satisfactory answer. It's one of those things that we just do, and it's lovely, and it's beautiful, but we're not sure where it came from. Until she finally finds the right source. She goes to see the particular wise old man who had long since retired from the altar. And she knows she's handling something that is treasured, and so she asks gently, as if approaching the Holy of Holies, why do we do this? Why do we touch that candlestick as we process in? He laughed loudly and he said, well, we used to have a carpet that built up so much static electricity that we had to ground ourselves so that we didn't keep shocking each other all throughout the service. The carpet was no longer there, but the living memory of doing this was. That, I believe, is actually a true story, but I cannot remember if somebody told it to me or if I read it, and so I just added some flourishes, but you get the idea. In our faith, we depend upon things. And by things, I mean practices. I mean structures. I mean thingy things that help us to tell the story, but which sometimes take on meaning far beyond their original intention. Now, the collect for this morning says, increase in us true religion and bring forth in us the fruit of good works. Now, I would be willing to hazard a guess that this morning in your morning devotions, you did not use that phrase, God, help me find true religion. That's not something we're going to put at the top of our website. We're not going to put it on t-shirts and on bumper stickers. It just doesn't make for really good swag. And yet, it does have some meaning for us. And to get there, I want to ask, not what would Jesus do? I'm sure you've heard that phrase, but rather, what did Cranmer mean? Okay, that's an inside joke. I'll explain it. Our services begin with a collect, which that word makes sense. We gather, we collect the intentions of the day into one succinct prayer, and those collects were initially written by Archbishop Thomas Cranmer in the 1500s when he drafted the very first Book of Common Prayer. Increase in us true religion. That is for this Sunday. Once a year, the 17th Sunday of ordinary time. But he did not mean what you think he meant. When we say increase in us true religion, that does not mean help us to memorize the dogma. It does not mean help us to perfect our ritual practices or our postures of reverence, but rather it asks God to nourish our awareness of what is good. Our awareness of what is good in us, our awareness of what is good in our neighbor, our awareness of what is good and creative and generous in God, and how God is moving through the world. True religion turns us towards the Latin word religio, which means faith. It means respect for moral behavior, a sense of obligation to one another. It means attention to the sacred and a reverence for who God created us to be and a reverence for who God is. But I think Cranmer might have been doing something that we are not supposed to do. We are not supposed to put zingers in our prayers or in our sermons, right, with double meaning and that kind of thing. But I think Thomas Cranmer did that here. Because when he said naming true religion, he was up to something. He was charting a path that was distinct from religious fundamentalism. When our prayer book was written, it was shaped in response to what at the time were two very hard-line approaches to the faith. On one hand, you had the Roman Catholic approach, which was a sacramental tradition, but one which required loyalty to a hierarchy of bishops. So that was one path. On the other path, we had continental Protestantism, which was rigidly committed to Scripture alone as the source of truth. Now, if you fast forward 500 years, you will find in our church something that I think pulls from the best of these. There were good things that both sides had to offer, but y'all, at the moment, they were killing each other over this. Literally, this was something that people were killing each other over, and to Cranmer's mind, there was nothing religious about that. Sure, we called it that, but that was not true religion. Now, I say with some pride that our church, imperfect though it may be, was born in part as a path away from fundamentalism. Now, we like to call ourselves the middle way, but that actually is a little bit kind of milquetoast. I think there's a far better way to see it, and that is that true religion, and that's not to say that we Episcopalians are true religion, but rather we are charting a path together. The true religion is something that transcends fundamentalism. It is not a nice, comfortable compromise, but rather a further stage in the development of faith, in maturity, and in amendment of life. Indeed, true religion calls us to action. In James's letter, he tells us, I'm paraphrasing here, to get off our spiritual butts and to put the word out into the world. I'll bet you didn't know that you had a spiritual butt. Now you do. James is preaching us out into the marketplace. It is fine and good to nod and hear the word politely, and maybe even bow reverently to the occasional candlestick, which I'm all for. But if we're really opening our hearts to the challenging and transforming Word of God, then what we do with that Word is what matters. Be doers and not just hearers. But I do want to caution us, though, about being doers but not hearers. Fundamentalism is always a risk. That's the reality of human life. And we too can run a risk, a kind of fundamentalism, if all we're focused on is action, but not thinking about the reflection, not thinking about the formation, about the inner work where God really reaches into us and changes us as well. If we're all action without having engaged the inner work, the work of soulful transformation within us, then we might be doing something like replacing one system of power with another, rather than building the beloved community which requires the transformation of each and every one of us. And James reminds us that when we act, we do so in response to God's goodness. Our actions are rooted in a word of truth given to us and are therefore, and here comes the word that I know we're all uncomfortable with, religious. It is actually something that is religious. Now, we live in a world where it is far more fashionable to say things like, I am spiritual but not religious, right? And given that, I'm not too sure what to do with that, because you can be totes spiritual but not do squat for your neighbor, right? Religion calls us to something deeper. True religion implies a far deeper relationship of commitment and fidelity to one another as children of the living God. Be doers of the word. Now, I know how we hear that. I know how we all want to hear it, and I do too. We hear that as, let's see some action. Let's take it to the streets. Let's subvert the dominant paradigm, and if possible, do so by 3:30 this afternoon. These instincts are good, and they are right, and they are faithful. We do live in a dominant paradigm. We do live amid a host of paradigms that are unholy and unjust, and it seems some days like no matter what we do, we can't quite seem to break out of them. We have lived our whole lives in these places, and we want with what we have, whether that's what years we have left or whatever we have in this life, we want to find a way to move this world to a place of justice and dignity, and we want to know what is the thing that we can do that can make that happen. Yes, yes, and yes. Remember, though, that being doers of the word requires a transformation of our whole lives and involves a whole lot more than what we see at the surface. What we see at the surface matters. That's part of what James is saying. But I also think that doing is a kind of an iceberg. And that what was there done at the surface is the end result of a whole lot of inner work that prepares us for the outer work. It is no accident, if we look to our own American history, that the civil rights movement was largely a spiritual movement. It was one of faith. These were religious figures who were taking the lead there that called for reflection and faith and a willingness to consider the cost of standing against systems of violence and injustice. Doing is action in the world, but it is also reflection and prayer and even study. Doing is raising your voice in the community for voting rights. Doing is serving a meal to those who are hungry. But doing is also relationship work. Doing is also aligning your whole life around generosity and gratitude. Doing is learning to check your own motivations and your own power, or even just using the power you have rightly. Doing requires courage and bravery. Doing can sometimes mean dying. It requires sacrifice, self-giving, and risk. Doing means making ourselves vulnerable, something that fundamentalism promises us we will never have to be. Increase in us true religion. That is the whole argument between Jesus and the Pharisees in the gospel passage. It is a disagreement about what holiness really means. Is holiness to be found in purity rituals and proper dishes and in candlesticks and in the washing of hands? I have to say, having been through a pandemic, I'm a big fan of the washing of hands, right? Or is it found in something more minimalist? In a rational world where we scoff at such things, knowing that we have the freedom to be spiritual without the commitments of religion. Yay! True religion is something else. True religion takes us beyond that, and it isn't simply a middle path between them. It's actually a different way altogether. One that transcends fundamentalism and tribe and draws us ever closer to the one who created us and who lives and moves in us. True religion is attention to what is good in us, what is good in our neighbor, what is good in God. And it is a keen awareness that that goodness is the lively and transformative presence of God in this world in which we live and in each and every one of us.